So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Soha Youssef, and I'm convening this seminar series on behalf of unu-merit and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Migration Seminar Series invites researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work related to migration. Before I will introduce today's speaker, there are some housekeeping that I'd like to get through. So our speakers' talk today would last approximately 40 minutes. It could be less. After which we will have some time dedicated for discussion, questions from the audience. I would like to ask you to keep your questions until after our presentation is over. However, if it's a question that's very important or it's a clarification question, of course, feel free to ask it. When we start the discussion, it would be nice if we can use the raise your hand mode on Zoom. And then we can allocate turns. You can also write your message in the chat box and I could read it out for you. Now, the seminar is going to be recorded, as I mentioned, so feel free to keep your camera on or off, however you see fit, but it will be on YouTube on our channel, so that's just for you to know. But we kindly ask you to try and keep all your microphones muted throughout the session so we don't interrupt the speaker. And that's it. This session could be then found within a week or so on our YouTube channel online. Now, let me introduce today's speaker. Loren Landau is a professor of migration and development at the University of Oxford and research professor at the University of the Wits African Center for Migration and Society. He has previously had visiting and faculty positions at Princeton, Georgetown, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. His interdisciplinary scholarship explores mobility, multi-scale governance, and the transformation of social political community across the Global South. You can get to know so much about his publications either on our event page or his page, but also he has consulted with the European Union, the World Bank, UNDP, UNHCR, UNECA, the Cities Alliance, and others. As chair of the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in South Africa, he served on the South African Immigration Advisory Board and is a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He holds a master's in development studies and a PhD in political science, and together with Jean-Pierre Misago, he co-founded and co-directs the WITS Oxford Mobility Governance Lab. With that being said, let me hand the floor to you. Thank you so much, Professor Landau.
No, thank you. Please let me know if there's any issues with the sound or the internet or the connection, but I'm really glad to be here and really glad to be sharing some of this work, which is something very much in progress. So the spirit of that, let me just give you a little background as to me and where I'm coming from. Hopefully this works. There we go. For the last, well, when you were reading out all of the things that I've done, does remind me that I've been doing this for a while. So for the last 20 years or so, 30 years, been researching migration largely in sub-Saharan Africa, moving first from working in rural areas and more recently really working on issues of the urban, looking at questions of urban transformation, urban mobility, and how cities, the literatures and discussions between cities and migrations intersect. One of the other themes that's happened over the last few years for me has been a move from what might be considered your kind of classic social science to really trying to think through different ways in which we can have these conversations, not just within the social sciences, but more broadly. As all of you will know, migration is an issue of quite contentious political is at the center of a lot of political debates. And most of those are not informed by our work. So increasingly trying to find ways of reaching people in new ways. And that's to some extent what I'm talking about. Why look at cities? Well, for those of you who don't know, that the population of the world is increasingly urbanized. This is happening worldwide. Areas like Europe, parts of Asia have been urbanized for a long time, but the cities of sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in Africa are among some of the fastest growing in the world. And these are cities that look quite different. These are cities that are following a different trajectory than the cities that are at the base of urban theory. These are cities that are growing very, very quickly with a population that is very young, a population that is very mobile, extremely diverse, and also are moving to cities in an era in which there are no jobs. So whereas industrialization or kind of other forms of development drove urbanization in Europe, in the United States, in most of Asia, the processes underlying urbanization in Africa are in some ways fundamentally different. And if we're really interested in the future of mobility, we're really interested in the future of migration, and we're interested in the future of Africa, this seems to be the place to look. A lot of the literature on African cities, however, comes very much from a kind of developmental standpoint, looking at poverty, looking at inequality, looking at social exclusion. That obviously is something that is very important, but I think has missed something about the social, something about the human, something about the spatial that is incredibly important. And that is part of what we're really trying to get at with this collaborative project. So let me begin by trying to show you a little bit about the kind of spaces that we're working in. And the project that I'm presenting today is a project that is spread across 3 countries and 3 cities. It's spread across Johannesburg, where I've been based for the last 20 years, but also Nairobi in Kenya and Accra in Ghana. We've worked particularly in what might be called, what I've called, urban estuaries. These are not the sort of town centers or the industrial areas where they exist, but rather the urban peripheries, the parts of the cities that are growing most quickly. And I think to give you a bit of an idea of what that looks like, and perhaps what it kind of feels like, I want to take you to a place called Diepsloot, which is just north of Johannesburg. If you went there 20 years ago, even 20 years ago, you would have more or less found a field, an empty space between Johannesburg and Pretoria, where there was some farming, but really not much else. Then the city of Johannesburg decided that they were going to create a temporary settlement there, a settlement where they could move people from other areas that were flood prone or with unsuitable housing, and they could stay there for a short time. They could stay there until more suitable housing could be found. And almost like there's nothing as permanent as a temporary migration or a migrant, there is almost nothing as permanent as a temporary city. And so over the 10 years that followed, this area that was meant to be temporary became basically a city of its own in a way, an urban periphery of about 150,000 people. It grew extremely quickly. It grew with people coming from all over the continent, but primarily all over South Africa, intersecting in a specific place. So here's mapping some of the data of people moving into this area in Diepsloot. This is an area that existed for 15 years, basically a sort of semi-city of 150,000 people, with no employers really, except for a mall and employment where there was in neighboring areas, and also a place without a police station. They eventually built a police station in about 2015, but the police are still afraid to go into many of the areas. As you saw from that image, you can't drive your cars through a lot of these areas, and the level of crime and the level of sort of violence is so much that the police only go in when they're really required. For the most part, it is a largely self-governing kind of space. And these are the kinds of spaces that we are seeing and kind of characterize a lot of urban growth across the continent. So here's similar maps from the 3 cities where we've worked. And what you start to see is these are spaces that are extremely diverse, people coming from all over the countries, coming from the region primarily. These are people, even domestic migrants, who might have the rights of citizenship, but speak a different language, belong to different kind of authority structures, and have different kinds of interest and trajectories. Oops, hold on one sec. I've now switched windows and lost mine. There we go. And you can see this to some extent, and this is all coming from data that we collected in 2020 and 2021. So it's not just that they come from very different sorts of places, it's also that they really intend to go very different places. So whereas a city like Berlin or a city like New York is often seen as a destination, as a place of having made it, these urban estuaries, these spaces where you have these multiple flows come together, are spaces that no one really wants to be. And they're often spaces where almost no one or very few people are from. Rather, these are spaces of flows where people move together, move across each other, move next to each other in multiple different ways. So the kind of spaces that we're talking about are deeply informal, often fairly unregulated by law. In the research that we've done, for example, on refugees and migrants, having documentation has very little impact on the kind of work that you can do, the kind of housing you can access. It doesn't even provide you the physical security. Even the police don't recognize your documentation. It's also, these spaces are highly unsettled. So this idea that you can talk about a community, there are people who live there for sure. There are people who might have lived there for a long time. So in the areas of Jamestown in Ghana, for example, there is what might be called an indigenous community, but they're now a minority surrounded by many other people who have come into these spaces. There are also places that people are not invested in. These aren't places people see as settling. We ask people, where do you want to raise your children? Almost no one will say, here. No one will say, this is where I see my future. In part because of this way of being unsettled, they're also highly multi-local. If you ask people, where is your family? It's usually not right there. Where do you want to invest money? It is not where you are. Where do you see your future, as I said? It's almost somewhere else. People are engaged in everyday life across multiple spaces, and sometimes the bulk of what really occupies them is somewhere else. They will live in a space only to pass through, only to get out. They're not looking necessarily for rights in this space. They're looking for usufruct rights, for the right to extract so that they can continue with their journey. And this has led us to start to see these, this kind of diversity in a new dimension. So it's not just ethnicity, it's not just language, it's also temporal. It's about a spatial temporal trajectories. So people who are moving quickly through the space, those who move a bit slowly, those who feel stuck, those who don't want to move. These kind of temporal horizons also create tensions and potential solidarities between these groups that are often invisible. They're things that we don't tend to pay attention to, and there's certainly things that we don't map or haven't adequately researched. What this kind of environment, I think, has also led us to understand is that while the language of precarity that has become very popular in speaking about the life of the poor, in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, in some ways suggests a kind of normality, and then people feel that they are now at risk, that there is another life, and then a way of living, social welfare state that has been taken away, economic security that has now been robbed. And what we've seen is that for a lot of people, there's not even an expectation of security. That the kind of lives that people live are so conditioned by the uncertainties that they face that it is giving rise to new ways of living. And you can see this just as a quick illustration in the kind of data we asked. So it's not so long ago, most of you will remember how disruptive the COVID pandemic was to your life, and how most of us, I think, felt quite down. We felt quite disrupted. Many of our plans, our temporal horizons had been fully upended as we sat at home trying to figure out what to do. But when we asked people after the pandemic, did you find the pandemic disruptive? Did you find it discouraging? What we didn't see was huge changes. Rather, only about 20% of people asked, right, or said that the pandemic really changed their lives. And as you can see here from Accra, people seemed even more optimistic following the pandemic than they were before. Not in Johannesburg and Nairobi, a little bit less, but it was really unsettling to us how this thing that was so disruptive to us as researchers wasn't so disruptive to people's lives because they've already built in the uncertainty of how to make a future, how to move around without the idea that you can't actually plan, that you might have a broad idea of where you want to go, but on a day-to-day level, anything can happen. And this is the very nature of people's lives. We also were really surprised when we started asking, well, how do you make a life in this space? And a lot of the literature on migration, going back to the Chicago schools and elsewhere, talks about ethnic enclaves, solidarities among homeboys or homegirls, communities that stick together to try to help each other out. And what we've seen, particularly in Johannesburg, but also in these other areas, that connection in the spaces where they are is not even something people necessarily desire. It is something in many ways that they fear. This kind of idea of belonging where you are is seen as almost dangerous. It's seen as binding, as getting in the way of you getting through these spaces, trying to find a way. So people will form relationships, and Abdul Malik Simone talks about this extensively in his kind of people as infrastructure. But you want to form relationships that can be chopped and changed. You want to form relationships that can be reinvented or redefined. You don't want to be known as one thing because that binds you. It will extract from you, in fact, when you want to try to get somewhere else. What we've also seen is that this idea that you can build a future, this idea that if I work hard, if I get education, if I'm able to do the right things, that I can get ahead. The kind of reasons that we all studied, that we went to graduate school, so we could move on with our careers. This is not necessarily something that people imagine. They cannot see paths forward clearly. They want things, they want wealth, they want security, but they can't see how to do this. The state is not there to help. Education doesn't result in jobs. And to some extent, there are not those jobs or career paths that they can follow. So instead, what we see is a turn among many people to the miraculous. The rise of Pentecostal churches is enormous. It's one of the few organizations that people in any of these spaces belong to, one of the few organizations that they give money to, and one of the few organizations they trust. But unlike the churches of old that were rooting, community building institutions, these churches are often very fluid themselves, changing ownership, dividing, and certainly preaching a kind of life of distanciation. Don't embed, separate yourself from the others who don't know the truth, who haven't followed my version of the gospel. And then something miraculous will be delivered unto you. Right? So this kind of way of living that we're seeing, which isn't entirely what we expected, but this kind of uncertainty is not about precarity. It's not about people trying to get back to how things were, to bring back the social support network of the welfare state, or to try to necessarily create a sort of development pathway in the way that we often imagine. Rather, these spaces have become ones where precarity and uncertainty, rather, are normalized. It's a different kind of life with different kinds of wants and different kinds of ethics of belonging. And for us, this has really raised a lot of issues about how we think about these spaces, how we theorize these spaces, ethically what we advocate for in terms of representation, in terms of membership, in terms of participation in political processes, because all of these things that are seen as progressive, that are seen as good, often rub uncomfortably against what it is that the people actually think they're doing or want to do. Rubs uncomfortably at an ethical level, but it also, this idea of community, of space-bound development, of integration, of people coming together around collective projects, doesn't work epistemologically. It blinds us to what is really happening. And so I think we, at an ethical level, but also at a conceptual level, we really need to view these things less in kind of Durkheimian terms, or the ways in which we've seen cities in the past, or this idea of a collective good, or the citizenry combined and forming a social contract with each other in the state, because that's not what's there, and it's not necessarily what people want. Instead, I think we need to draw on some of the more post-structuralist theories around Deleuze, Césaire, and Glissant, who help us understand spaces in relational terms, that the space is not bound by the connection to each other and others in that space, but rather it is formed by its relationship to other spaces. It's not just about living in the present to build a future. It's how people relate to the past. It's how people imagine their futures, or in some instances, living when you cannot imagine a future. And I think this has asked us really to think much more imaginatively about how we think about space, how we think about migration, and how we study migration. And this is where we start to get to the project that we're doing now, this Atlas of Uncertainty, which is really looking at how we've studied migration in the past, and particularly what it hides, what it reveals, but also the kind of ethical underpinnings of it, which don't work well to make sense of what people are trying to do, right? So the classic atlas, if we go back historically to Mercator, who is the first one apparently to make an atlas, right? These were things that were created so that others could know new spaces, could know other spaces. They were spaces, they were designed so that we could conquer, so that we could control, we could categorize, and we used systems that made sense to us. These were ways of seeing the world that we codified. And that spirit of codification and control of the others has continued and continues to inform migration studies. And so we continue to get maps like this, right, which are codified in terms of nation states, which work in ways that make sense to policymakers and help simplify the world in ways that hide many of the processes and many of the kind of ways of being and belonging that I was just speaking about. Even the more complex ones, which show these relations in certain ways, still tend to use the sort of categories of public administration. They tend to use the spaces as defined by others. They tend to think of migrations in the way that the state measures it. Urbanization is a once-off thing. Migration as once-off, categorizing people into refugees or migrants or into something else, to labor migrants, when a lot of these categories don't actually map onto people's real experiences. So what we're trying to do, it's still, and this is the work that's in progress, the empirical work has been done. The new project is a mix of an art exhibition and a book and continued conversations about, which we see as a kind of counter cartography, which is meant to unsettle the atlas as a tool for others to make sense, but rather to leave it as an open-ended tool that can allow us to feel and to see and to hear what people in these spaces are trying to achieve, and what, through their actions, through their attitudes, through their interactions, through their relationships, what they are creating. Not necessarily out of design, but de facto, what are the products of what they're doing? And this means trying to tell stories in different ways, and in many ways to move, and it's a cheesy line, but it's one we've come to like, right from the senses of categorizing everyone in the way we've defined to the senses, to letting migrants, but voices and perspectives come through so that we can feel what it is like a bit better to live in these spaces and to be part of the transformations that are taking place. And to do this, we've started with the statistics and the focus groups and all the standard stuff. And we're now working with artists who are working in each of these three cities, in Accra, in Johannesburg, and in Nairobi. And we're working with authors, some social scientists, but also people working in the humanities and others who can try to capture these kind of mobilities and these spatial transformations in different ways. And we've also worked with a mapping team at Columbia University in New York to try to represent this data in ways that is unsettling, that doesn't conform to the kind of neat nation state ideas, but can instead try to show us what life is like in a slightly different way. So I'm going to just, for the rest of the presentation, the next 5 or 6 minutes, try to show you a little bit about what we've produced. If you're excited by this, most of it will eventually be online, but there is also an exhibit that will be opening in May in Johannesburg. And of course, you're all welcome to that. And we're trying to find ways to bring this exhibit elsewhere. But of course, that requires money that we don't have. Right. So what we've done with this one, and I hope it's big enough on your screens to see it well, is to try to look not at individual journeys, but to understand family structures, households. So we, in each of the three cities, with Accra, Johannesburg, and Nairobi moving across the screen, ask people, who do you live with and where are they from? And what you start to see here, again, is just the diversity of household types and the kind of spatial origins of those households. Each one of those circles represents a different household. And if there's one thing that's come through in all of our work is that there is such a diversity of experiences and such a diversity of ways in which people are negotiating this uncertainty that to say African migration is anything but just diverse does a lot of disservice to trying to understand what's really happening here. So you can start to see these at a sort of closer level here. The next thing we tried to do was ask about how people's journeys and their futures connect. And what you can see here is three questions all combined: where you come from, where you send money to, and where you hope to live in the future. So we've got, thousands of respondents and lots again of very different sorts of responses. The one on the left of Nairobi, and I've just picked these as illustrations, is kind of the classic story of African migration and urbanization, which is I come from a village and I moved to the city and I send money back home. The classic remittance story. And I send that money home to support my family now, but also because I expect to live there in the future. I will retire there. I will build my house there. I will buy cows there. That's the story, and that reflects about 20 or 30% of what we see. But then we also start to see these much more complicated stories where people are living in one place, sending from another place, but sometimes sending money to multiple other places across the diaspora as families disperse to deal with uncertainty. And in many instances, they may still expect to live in yet a place where nobody is. So we see that in Johannesburg, someone coming from one place, sending money elsewhere, but imagining a future, and I believe in this case, somewhere in the United States or North America. So these kind of diversity of spatial and temporal horizons is a form of difference that we really don't understand and has real impact for how people organize, how they relate to each other, and what it feels like to be in the city, right? So we've been very excited about these maps, but in some ways don't feel like they've gone far enough to get at this goal of helping people feel, helping people think about these places in different ways. And this is where some of the artistic work has been really powerful. So this work is still being made. So I can only show you a few things here of work that has already been done. But you can see this one from Nairobi. I'm gonna, if you can hear it too. Right, so Daniel's work, again, engaging with the work we got and the maps about being in and out of a place at one time, about moving through the city, either not being seen or not trying not to be seen, because you don't want those connections, you don't want the risk that we talked about before around friendship or sociality. And right, this kind of haunting of the city, of being a kind of ghost in the place that you live. We then worked with Awad Sega, who's a Ghanaian-based artist, who is very interested in this idea of family and what family means when you are so dispersed and you're not quite sure where you're going to go, and you're not sure quite how the world around you is going to take shape. And she tried to capture this. Well, I think she's captured it very well. And she describes it as a kind of your family, but more like a school of fish rather than a stable family unit. A school of fish, of course, being something that moves together or can, but can be easily separated. You might move with intention to one direction, but if the current shifts, a predator arrives, you will quickly have to take shape. You might divide, you come back together, and yet you're always somehow aware that others are around you. This is how she describes it. And to me, that through this image helps me feel and see what that would be like in a way that our statistics and certainly even our maps wouldn't. Just a couple more and then I'll stop talking. Here's one from Johannesburg, which also then tries to capture this sort of idea of ongoing journeys, of people moving, but across multiple temporal and spatial dimensions. So Johannesburg, of course, being a mining city, being a city that was created by mines, bringing millions of people into work in the mines, but a city that continues to exist even though the mines have now closed. And so people connected to that history, moving through in different ways, but as you see on the right side now, doing waste picking, doing other things, waiting for something that may come in the future. This kind of multi-layered spatial temporal experience with the deep uncertainty of what's to come, I think reflected in many ways the very themes that we're representing, but can potentially speak to a different audience. It certainly speaks in a very different way than the migration studies or the urban planning literature would represent migration and mobility in the city. So just go quickly through. This one is also from Johannesburg. This is one of the brand new pieces. We just saw this for the first time last week. But again, trying to represent someone's more spatial map of the city, the way they understand it subjectively, the way they move through the city, and the kind of spaces that those represent for them in a way that relates to the physical form of the city, but doesn't look like anyone else's map of the city. Then we have this great project from Ghana, which is with the Kayeyes, who are basically women who work in the marketplace, who carry things. They're porters, they're traders. And what you can see on this woman's arm is the village that she's from. So apparently many women will tattoo their village in case they are lost in the city, in case they die in the city, in case they are abducted, so that people will always know how they can get back home. Right? An incredible way in which people are even mapping themselves on their own bodies as they move through the uncertainty of the city. The last two then are both one from South Africa, but trying to capture some of the connections and disconnections, some of the silencing, some of the invisibility of being in the city. These are both quite large works, so these are just little corners of them. But I think you'll agree that these speak in ways to the themes that we discussed, the things that we found in the research, but hopefully in ways that can start new conversations, right? So just as we end, sorry, turn off the sound, right? Just to invite all of you to continue to follow this. We're online, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. I think we're trying to figure out how to use Blue Sky. If you'd like to follow this process, it's ongoing, it's open to other participation. We hope it can be a new way of studying migration and conducting these kind of counter cartographies that can help us see things and see things in the cities in ways that we have yet to do. So I'm going to end there, and I look forward to your questions and the conversations in the time we have left. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loren, for this very insightful presentation. Let's give the floor right away to anyone that may have a question or a comment. Please feel free to use the raise the hand button on Zoom. I see Melissa, please go ahead.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me okay. I don't have too much background noise, but thank you so much, Loren. That was really interesting, and it's great to hear more about this project. I do have a couple of different questions. I guess one question has to do with time spent in these kind of periphery areas, and if people's own planning or own ideas about their temporality also changes over time. So, for example, they first come to an area thinking that, okay, they're going to be there very temporarily, maybe a year, maybe two. But after they're there for 5 years or 10 years, do they start to think about time in a different way, or do they also adjust their goals? And then I was also wondering in how far you have also compared these areas to refugee camps, because I was, thinking immediately that, again, refugee camps are usually set up meant to be very temporary. They often turn into something not temporary at all. And how people also see themselves in these camps. So many people see themselves as, wanting to transit through, but are not able to for one reason or another. And so I just saw a lot of parallels to the stories that you were telling now with the stories that we often see in refugee camps. So let me stop there for the moment and let you respond to those things.
Oh, those are great questions, and I'll take the second one first, because I think that's maybe easier, and to some extent I think you're absolutely right. There are enormous parallels here, and I think Zygmunt Bauman talks about refugee camps and sort of what he imagines is sort of elite urban spaces, sort of downtown London or New York, where as they're both the kind of outside of normal time and space, they're places that people flow through. And we often see that as in the kind of elite world and with refugees. But I think what we're now seeing is that this is becoming the norm for huge parts of cities, right? And not just the elite, but it's almost everyone. And it really raises the question of what will these cities be? What kind of politics? If this is not just a kind of exceptional thing, a refugee camp or a Wall Street, but this is where millions of people are going to be living in the future. What sort of life is that going to generate? What will cities and migration, community politics look like going forward? And yeah, maybe they will settle to your first question, and maybe things will over time kind of this sort of mobility, and to some extent these places are too new to know, right? So a place like Diepsloot, we're only now just seeing the first people who were even born there, right? And because no one has been from a place like that. And the truth is no one ever wanted to be there and to stay there. Some people definitely will stay, but we talked to a lot of migrants, both domestic and international, in places like Johannesburg and Nairobi, and they may start to see the city as a whole as a place they might live if they can somehow get to a place that is suitable, that doesn't have sewage running outside of their door, that isn't risk being knocked down by a developer, by the city. So I think the ways in these sort of spaces that they live in don't even allow you to imagine that you could stay there for the rest of your life, because they're not places you could raise children. They're not places you can ever own land. and they can be knocked down at almost any time. So yeah, I think there will be people who settle, and there'll be people who definitely change their trajectories, just like all of us do in our lives. But I think, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, these spaces will continue to be these nowherevilles, if we want to use Bauman's language.
Thank you. Can we take more questions? Talita, go ahead.
Thanks. So just to follow up on that while you were presenting, Loren, and thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. And I'll definitely follow the project online, maybe in person. I was wondering, I was trying to rack my head as to whether we have like historical precedents for such places, where like uncertainty becomes so normalized, and as you were saying, there's no sense of belonging, very little investment in place and in community, and no sense of futurity. And I was just, I mean, not that I am a great historian, but trying to think of examples where, and none of them yet kind of offer any parallels. And I wonder to what extent your team has thought about whether there are any historical precedents that we can, I mean, human history is long and complex, and there have been protracted crises and uncertainty or anything like that. So I was wondering to what extent you've thought about, whether there are such parallels in history and what we might learn for, indeed, as you were saying, what happens to society, what happens to communities, which exist like this for a long period of time.
It's a great question, and there's he's now deceased, but a great African urban historian, Bill Freund, who is always calling on us to sort of embed this work a bit more historically, because like many social scientists, we look at what's in front of us and it surprises us, and we think this is brand new. So we have been looking, right? And there's certainly, at a superficial level, at least, if you read Charles Dickens, like the kind of life people live in, newly urbanized, newly industrialized London, or the Lower East Side in New York during the Depression. There's a lot of this similar, right, in the sort of uncertainty. But I think what's different is that where you can imagine that the trajectory going. So New York at the time, or London, these were industrializing cities. These were places that actually needed labor. Maybe not all the labor that they had, but they needed labor, and there was a system that was both of society was being disciplined by the market and being disciplined by the state and organized in that way. And I think that's part of what gave birth to the highly unequal but more stable systems that we see today in those places. And what's not clear is where that kind of disciplining, that kind of regulation would come from. So Simmel talks about how the factory organizes everyone so that we all live in the same sort of time. Got to get there at time. We follow, we commodify our time into the hour that we then sell for work. These places don't have factories, right? There's barely anyone who has a job, right? Everyone does lots of work. They work hard, but this idea of a daily job, of that routine, is not there. And the states that also go into these areas, I often think of Gangs of New York, the movie, the Scorsese movie, where it was quite chaotic, and eventually the state sort of moves in and asserts order. It seems very unlikely that these states have the capacity or even the interest to engage in these communities in that way. Maybe that will come, but I don't know that we have a historical precedent. Certainly this kind of urban growth, this many people living in close proximity without jobs, and in many places kind of without a state. And we often talk of them as these DIY cities, but they're massive. And, what that gives birth to, I think is kind of anyone's guess. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
We have a question in the chat box. I'll take your question afterwards, Valeska. So it's from Belinda. Hi, Loren, great presentation and project. To what extent are people's different imagined futures a source of discord and conflict within these spaces? Or is there a general indifference to others that leads to a kind of mutual tolerance?
This is a great question. Thank you, Belinda, and greetings to sunny, snowy Ottawa. I think the answer is yes to both. You know, in some places, you know, the kind of, I have one of my PhD students who's working right now in Old Fadama, one of the cities, one of our sort of research sites in Ghana, in Accra. And there is very much a kind of nonchalance or blasé attitude towards each other, and a kind of conviviality that emerges because everyone wants to be as safe as they can, but no one wants to really invest in making things safe and good. And that these kind of different trajectories seem to work well in that way. But even in other parts of Accra, where you had, as I mentioned in Jamestown, an indigenous community who feels as if their future is now being stolen by all of these other people who are moving in and moving through, it is a real source of tension. And in South Africa also, as you probably know, you know, there will be the South Africans who see themselves having a particular trajectory related to overcoming apartheid, relating to getting certain types of work or benefits. And they are quite resentful of others who are not following in their kind of spatial temporal trajectories. And I think there's incredible tensions between those groups. So it's highly contingent on who's there, their migration histories, how they interact, what resources they think they're after. But that, as I was saying, this kind of diversity is the one constant that we're seeing across the research sites.
Thank you. Let's take Valeska's question.
Thank you. Thanks, Loren. This is really, really interesting and mind-tickling. And I think you really offer a sort of a different way of conceptualizing migration, which comes sort of intuitive. I mean, was just looking at everyone who had the camera on. All of us are migrants, and somehow we don't live in deep sloot areas, but we still, I can relate to that kind of diagram that you had with the different questions and the mapping a different atlas, you know, or the, as you said, the relatable of the artwork. And so I feel almost embarrassed to ask a very non-conceptual question, and that is sort of, okay, so if we do reconceptualize migration in that kind of emotional, personal way, how does that inform then migration governance in terms of not only sort of service provision in such urban areas, which are hardly accessible? You said police only came in very late and so on, but also the sheer, you know, the kind of documentation of people, or the even I don't know if you even would go so far as to say it can even help us understand better movement across borders and border management and things like that. So I wonder, do you see in this in any way, or is there somehow for you also something emerging which would inform so better migration governance towards communities that aren't following the logic of the current migration system?
Yeah, it is something that worries me, and we've been doing some work also with groups like the Cities Alliance and others who are more practically oriented than this project is, and trying to figure out what this means, right, for not just how we govern migration, but also what urban planning looks like, right? And you know, a lot of urban planning works very much on this progressive urban planning. I mean, there's the urban planning of just trying to keep the poor out of the city, which, you know, and separate, which is going ahead quite well. But the more progressive urban planning of, which is founded on this kind of idea of the rights to the city. And underlying that is a particular understanding of what rights are, which comes from Lefebvre, who is talking basically about France and about workers, right, who move to the city and have built the place and have jobs, but then are excluded from the benefits that they produce. But that makes a lot of presumptions about the kind of work they have, about what they want, that they want to be seen, that they want inclusion. And what we see is that when I showed you that one, people don't even want friends, let alone like inclusion in that space. It asks a different question, I think, for us as, let's say, progressive urban planner. Like, what are we trying to do when we say we need to promote inclusion, we need to promote representation, we need to promote visibility to the state and recognition? That's not what they want. And I think it asks us to think about different forms of governance that might accommodate and raises ethical questions of like, how much should we accommodate this? Or how much do we really need people to actually commit to where they live? I think also on the sort of broader migration governance side, and I'd be interested what you think, is really to recognize that the categories that we have about how people migrate and move and how we codify them don't really reflect how they are moving. And by relying on those categories to make sense of migration, which is what we do through official statistics, we're actually not seeing what's happening, right? And we need to think about how do we collect data that actually reflects people's mobility, how they are transforming the worlds they're building, so that as planners or whatever, you can actually see what's happening in front of you. Because I think right now we don't. Looks like I'm off the hook.
I'm checking if there are any raise the hand. No. Any last questions, comments? There's a question from Simon. A great presentation, Loren. What is your comment on ghost cities, especially during the festive season when great percentage of people move to up country to join their families and kin?
Right. I mean, it's another kind of mobility, but it's not only the cities that are ghosts. I mean, we have large parts of the countryside where all you have is basically old people left behind. There's areas increasingly through climate change that were vibrant agricultural communities that are now empty or unviable. And I think understanding how those spaces retain connections and are part of people's imaginations, part of their moral economies, part of their material economies, those are the things that we need to map, not just the remittances and not just the actual movements, but how these all fit together in the way in which people are making sense and trying to create futures for themselves.
I think we answered all the questions. Thank you, Melissa, for your comment. Thank you so much, Loren, for taking the time for this presentation. It was absolutely insightful, and we were so delighted to have you here with us. So thank you so much. And we look forward to many more seminars to come for the rest.
Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you.
please, if you have further comments or would like to come visit us in Johannesburg in May, please be in touch.
Thank you. Bye.